Imagine waking in the dead of night to find every person you've ever known has evaporated into darkness. No bloodshed, no bodies, not a single trace. This wasn't some twisted nightmare. It was the horrifying reality Governor John White faced in 1590 when he returned to Roanoke. 3 years earlier, he'd left behind 117 souls, including his own daughter and an infant granddaughter. What's left? Nothing but ghost town emptiness and a single mocking word carved into a post. Croatan. What force could make an entire colony of men, women, and children disappear without a trace? Was it slow starvation that drove them to desperate measures? Native slaughter? Or something far more sinister? Something that still lurks in the shadows of America's earliest history? Recent archaeological findings have unearthed disturbing clues. A copper ring tarnished with what might be blood, pottery fragments arranged in unnatural patterns, and buried personal items that no settler would willingly abandon. These aren't just historical artifacts. They're the last silent screams of America's first missing colony. When John White set sail in 1587, he carried dreams of glory, not premonitions of horror. The 117 souls aboard the Lion, including his heavily pregnant daughter Eleanor, were to be the founding heartbeat of England's New World Empire. None could foresee they were passengers on a one-way journey into oblivion. Their doom began before they ever touched shore. Captain Simon Fernandez, their Portuguese pilot, betrayed them with a simple, devastating decision. Ignoring direct orders, he abandoned the planned settlement at Chesapeake Bay, instead dumping the colonists on Roanoke Island, a place already stained with English blood. Was this mere convenience, or was Fernandez carrying out some darker purpose? Those who witnessed his smile as he sailed away would later recall its unsettling emptiness. The settlers' inheritance was grim, the charred skeleton of an earlier failed colony, soil too poor to sustain life, and the watchful eyes of the Secretan people, who had already proven their willingness to burn English settlements to ash. As food dwindled to crumbs, the colonists watched their children's faces hollow with hunger. When George Howe's mutilated corpse was discovered, crab fishing equipment still clutched in his stiffened hands, paralyzing fear infected the settlement. White faced an impossible choice: abandon his daughter and newborn granddaughter to seek help, or stay and watch everyone he loved slowly starve. His journey back to England became a descent through maritime hell. Storm-lashed seas nearly claimed his vessel off Ireland, and upon reaching England, he found a nation consumed by war preparation, deaf to his increasingly desperate pleas. For 3 agonizing years, White begged for ships while nightmares of his family's suffering haunted his sleep. When he finally returned in August 1590, the true nightmare began. The colony stood silent as a tomb. Houses had been methodically dismantled, not destroyed in panic or attack, suggesting the colonists had time to plan whatever came next. The carved Croatan offered hope they'd relocated, but the absence of the agreed-upon distress symbol suggested something even White couldn't comprehend. As hurricane winds forced his rescue ship to abandon the search, White stood on the receding deck, watching Roanoke Island, and any chance of finding his family, disappear forever into the mist. He died years later, a broken man consumed by the most terrifying question a father could face: what unspeakable fate befell his child? While historians debate rational explanations, the Carolina Algonquians' oral traditions whisper of something far more horrifying. To them, the English weren't just invaders. They were harbingers of invisible death. European diseases swept through native villages like vengeful spirits, leaving corpses with skin covered in weeping sores and eyes frozen open in terror. Entire communities vanished in days, while the English remained untouched, proof to survivors that these pale strangers wielded powers beyond mortal understanding. Mantio was no ordinary shaman. The eldest son of a powerful spiritual lineage, he had inherited ancient knowledge forbidden to most tribe members. As he watched his people die while colonists demanded food during the worst drought in memory, something inside him broke. The ritual he performed wasn't mere superstition. It was the darkest corner of Algonquian spiritual practice, never before unleashed on human enemies. For 3 days, Mantio knelt in a sacred grove, his body contorting as he fasted beyond human endurance. Witnesses described how the air around him shimmered like heat rising from flame, though the night was bitterly cold. Using carved effigies of the colonists fashioned from stolen hair and clothing, he summoned entities the Algonquian people themselves feared to name, ancient spirits predating human memory who demanded terrible payment for their intervention. The colony's disintegration followed patterns too precise to be coincidence. Livestock died with their hearts missing, but no wounds visible. Food rotted overnight despite salt preservation. Children woke screaming about figures standing motionless in corners of their homes, figures visible only to them. Governor White's recovered journal pages describe colonists clawing at their own skin, claiming to feel something crawling beneath it. The colony's final weeks reveal mounting psychological terror. 2 fishermen were found dead, their faces frozen in expressions so horrifying that witnesses refused to describe them. When a young boy disappeared for 3 days, his return brought no relief. He spoke backwards, exclusively in Algonquian phrases he couldn't possibly know, and his eyes had changed from blue to jet black. His family claimed his shadow sometimes moved independently of his body. Reverend Lambert's attempted exorcism became the colony's breaking point. As he recited prayers, witnesses described the ground trembling beneath their feet and the boy speaking with multiple voices simultaneously. That night, inhuman screams echoed from the forest. Not animal, not human, but something that made even the most hardened colonists tremble. Within days, they abandoned everything, even weapons vital for survival. Mantio lived to see his vengeance complete, but victory brought its own curse. The summoned entities refused to depart, bringing twisted births and unexplained disappearances to his own people. When Mantio himself vanished during a storm in 1591, his body was never found, though fishermen claimed to see his silhouette walking upright beneath the waves for years afterward. In 1937, the ground beneath the Elizabethan gardens gave up a secret it had guarded for centuries. Buried beneath a collapsed chimney lay a leather-bound diary, the intimate chronicle of a young girl named Margaret. Her words, preserved in the airless tomb of clay and stone, offer the most visceral glimpse into Roanoke's descent into darkness. The early entries pulse with childlike optimism. Margaret writes of father building our home with strong timber, and mother's garden where English flowers will bloom. But this innocence withers like the failing crops, replaced by mounting dread. By late autumn, her handwriting grows jagged as she describes receiving half rations of moldy biscuit that crawls with weevils when broken. Her account of trading with the Algonquian reveals how quickly paradise soured. They look at us with hard eyes now, as if we are ghosts already. Winter brings passages that defy rational explanation. Margaret describes waking to find footprints circling her bed, inside her locked home, though fresh snow outside shows no tracks approaching or leaving. They are small like a child's, she writes, yet pressed so deeply into the earth as if made by something impossibly heavy. Most disturbing are her accounts of voices in the forest. "They call names at night," she writes, "names of people who died on the voyage here. When a 6-year-old boy vanishes for 3 days and returns speaking what Reverend Lambert calls devil's words." Margaret records how his mother claimed, "Something looks out through his eyes that is not my son." The boy drew symbols on walls that matched markings found on trees at the forest's edge. Crude imitations of English letters arranged in patterns that, when viewed from certain angles, formed faces. The colony's physical decline mirrors its psychological collapse. January 1588 brings an entry about men fighting over a dead crow, tearing at raw flesh with their bare hands like animals, their eyes empty of humanity. Livestock disappearances are attributed not to wolves or natives, but to something that leaves blood trails that simply stop in open fields, as if the animals were lifted into the air. Most chilling is Margaret's description of George Howe's murder. His body bore his own fishing spear driven through his eye, though he carried no such weapon when he left. The colonists buried him facing east after Reverend Lambert insisted this would prevent his return, though Margaret doesn't explain what he meant. As leadership disintegrates in White's absence, Margaret writes of adults, whispering of leaving but arguing about where safety might be found. Dogs refuse to enter certain houses, their fur bristling as they stare into empty corners. Children report seeing figures standing at the foot of their beds, figures that disappear when adults enter with lanterns. Her final entries document the planned exodus. "Father says we go to Croatan when the moon is right," she writes with renewed hope. But her last words, scrawled in handwriting barely recognizable as hers, contain only terror. "The shadows move when you don't look." Forensic analysis revealed not just tear stains but deep impressions, as if Margaret had pressed the quill into the paper with such force that her fingers nearly punctured the page. The diary ends there. Whatever Margaret witnessed in her final moments remains locked in eternal silence. Some horrors arrive not with dramatic violence, but with a merciless grip of environmental collapse. The drought that descended upon Roanoke Island from 1587 to 1589 was a silent predator, perhaps the most relentless enemy the colonists faced. Tree ring studies reveal these were the driest years in 8 centuries. Rainfall plummeted 40% below normal, transforming fertile lands into dust. The parched earth cracked under a merciless sun, yielding harvests so meager they barely warranted collection. The colonists' European crops withered and died in soil they didn't understand, while unfamiliar fishing grounds yielded catches too small to sustain life. Within months, hollow-cheeked children cried themselves to sleep with empty stomachs. Archaeological evidence tells the grim story. Fish bones found at the site show signs of being sucked clean of marrow, while leather goods bear teeth marks, evidence of colonists chewing boots and belts when nothing else remained. Burial sites reveal bodies with distinctive skeletal markers of prolonged malnutrition, some with green staining on their teeth, a sign they resorted to eating plants known to be toxic. The drought transformed relationships with the Algonquian from uneasy alliance to dangerous dependency. Margaret's diary tells how natives bringing half-empty baskets would stand just beyond musket range, making us come to them like beggars. As the English grew more desperate, armed groups were sent to request food, diplomatic language for what amounted to armed robbery. Each confrontation left both sides more convinced the other sought their destruction. What modern archaeologists find most disturbing are the patterns of soil disruption around the settlement, evidence of increasingly frantic attempts to find water. Wells were dug to dangerous depths, some collapsing and becoming impromptu graves. The deepest reached brackish water that laboratory analysis shows contains salt levels high enough to cause hallucinations when consumed by dehydrated individuals. This toxic water may explain accounts of colonists seeing things that weren't there in the final months. By summer 1589, the colonists faced extinction math, simple calculations of remaining food divided by mouths to feed, with results that promised only death if they remained. Archaeological evidence suggests they dismantled structures methodically, likely to build boats or carry materials to a new location. But where could they go? The Croatan carving suggests one destination, but evidence indicates the group splintered, some heading to Hatteras Island, others venturing inland toward the Chowan River where friendly tribes might shelter them. Most haunting are the items deliberately left behind, personal possessions carefully buried rather than carried, suggesting their owners never expected to reclaim them. Among these was a child's wooden doll with cloth hair, placed in a small handmade coffin alongside pressed flowers, a ritual burial of innocence itself. That single word carved into a weathered post, Croatan, represents America's first unsolved disappearance. For centuries, it has taunted investigators with its cryptic simplicity. This wasn't random graffiti, but a deliberate message pointing to the Croatan tribe on Hatteras Island, 50 miles south of the settlement. What most historical accounts downplay is the unsettling timing of the carving. John White found it in August 1590, but tree growth analysis suggests it was made in early winter, evidence the colonists remained at Roanoke nearly 2 years after White's departure before reaching their breaking point. What forces finally drove them to abandon their homes after enduring so much? Oral histories collected from the Hatteras Indians in 1701 contain disturbing details rarely emphasized in mainstream accounts. Explorer John Lawson documented stories of pale ghosts who arrived at night, some walking and some floating just above the ground, while historians interpret these as metaphorical descriptions of exhausted survivors. The native accounts insist some arrivals were not fully human anymore after their ordeal at Roanoke. Most unsettling were accounts of survivors who brought shadows with them that moved independently, and children who spoke with the voices of the old ones. Archaeological evidence from Hatteras Island confirms English presence, but raises more questions than it answers. Excavations uncovered Elizabethan artifacts arranged in patterns inconsistent with normal use, a rapier handle positioned vertically in soil as if deliberately planted, gun parts arranged in a perfect circle, and a slate writing tablet buried face down with incomprehensible symbols etched into its underside. The mystery of Roanoke isn't merely historical curiosity. It's America's original nightmare, a story of disappearance without resolution that still echoes in our collective unconscious. What truly happened to these 117 souls who vanished from history? The evidence points not to a single catastrophic event, but to a slow-motion collapse, a perfect storm of environmental disaster, cultural collision, and psychological unraveling. The colonists didn't simply vanish in one night of violence. They disintegrated gradually, their English identity eroding under pressures few modern humans could comprehend. Margaret's diary, Mantio's ambiguous role, and John White's agonizing search converge on a disturbing truth. Roanoke represents not just America's first missing persons case, but our first encounter with the psychological abyss that opens when civilization's thin veneer cracks. The colonists who survived physically may have lost something more fundamental, their very conception of themselves. The most haunting possibility isn't that they died, but that they became unrecognizable to the very civilization that sent them. The single word Croatan may represent not just a destination, but an epitaph for their former selves. As night falls over Roanoke today, visitors sometimes report strange phenomena, unexplained lights, whispered voices in archaic English, and the sensation of being watched from the tree line. Science dismisses these as suggestion and atmospheric conditions, but the persistent accounts across centuries raise disquieting questions. Perhaps the real horror of Roanoke isn't that the colonists vanished without a trace, but that something of them remains, trapped in the liminal space between history and myth, between the world they left behind and the one they created in their final desperate days. What secrets still lie buried in the silent earth of Roanoke? And are some truths better left undisturbed?